is going on, YouTube? Before we get into this next video, I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. We're at about 4,300 right now, and my goal is to get to 5,000 within the next few months. I like the number 5,000, so I'm hoping you guys can help me out here. This video is going to be a little bit different from those that I've done in the past. I'm going to be going over why I bought, modified, and then ultimately ended up selling my 80 series Land Cruiser. And then I'm just going to give my own words of advice to anybody who currently owns one or wants to own one. I want to preface this by just saying that I'm not an expert with these. I did own one for a few years, and I have a few friends that are much more knowledgeable than myself, but this is just the knowledge that I gained, over those few years that I owned it. For those of you who don't know, the 80 series Land Cruiser is the third generation of Land Cruiser that was offered in the United States between 1991 and 1997. And most people would argue that this generation is the best generation, if you will, for hardcore off-roading. And some of the features that make this generation so popular would be the fact that it's four-way coil sprung. It has a extremely reliable large inline-six engine. It has front and rear solid axles, and it also has a really long wheelbase as well. And also very important is the fact that it's a near perfect combination of old and new. It's old enough that most 80 series owners will tackle their basic maintenance and even attempt some of the harder jobs as well too. But then it's new enough to have all of the comforts and conveniences you would expect to have in a daily driver. Okay, so from here we're going to be getting into why I bought my own 80 series Land Cruiser. Coming from a background of Subarus, as you can tell from some of my older videos, I've never really had any experience in four-wheel drive vehicles. With this being said, one of my buddies who was actually into Subarus back in the day as well too, ended up going to the military and was in the market for a four-wheel drive and actually ended up buying a modified 80 series Land Cruiser. After a few years of ownership, he really grew to love it and actually convinced me to end up buying one of these Japanese buckets. So at the time when I was in the market, these were starting to get popular but weren't, crazy expensive as they are now. I ended up finding a pretty clean 97 40th anniversary, and even though it was high mileage, it seemed to be pretty well taken care of. I took it for a test drive and I was hit with a number of sensations. Firstly, it felt like a tank. It legit felt like I was driving a semi-truck or something. Like if I plowed into a Civic, it felt like I would legitimately flatten them, but then my car would be totally fine. Some of the other sensations I was hit with is that the steering wheel is super loose, which I came to find is actually pretty normal for these. The other thing is that the windshield is like right in front of your face, like you can halfway extend your arm and touch the windshield. And then on top of that, you just feel like you're looking through one whole thing of glass. There's literally like no blind spots in this thing. Long story short, while this thing was completely new for me, I literally had zero experience with, four-wheel drive or anything like that. I ended up buying it. So at this point, I had myself a stock 40th anniversary 80 series Land Cruiser. It did have some mechanical issues, such as a leaking rear main seal. I don't think the head gasket was ever replaced, and a lot of the coolant hoses looked pretty tired and cracked. But besides that, it was pretty clean and ready to go. So within about 3 to 4 months of buying this completely stock 40th anniversary Land Cruiser, I went pretty ham with the mods. It got a 2-inch lift, front and rear bumpers, sliders, and 35s. I did do the mods to improve capability for off-roading, but a big part of it was the look, to be honest. Looking back, even though it looked sweet, it was totally overkill, unless I was going to do some really hardcore off-roading. And I did do a decent amount, but most of it was around the intermediate level, I'd say. The thing that I didn't really understand at the time is that the 80 series is super capable in its stock form and probably easily could have done everything I did when it was modified. So I went from having a super reliable stock 80 series with a few minor problems to like this crazy capable modified four-wheel drive vehicle with new issues seeming to pop up every time I would take it out on a trail. And to be fair, most of these issues were pretty peripheral and not that serious, but when it was stock, I didn't have any problems. Personally, I think adding the extra weight and the bigger tires just made issues happen sooner that would have eventually presented themselves. Granted, it was a 25-year-old vehicle with well over 200,000 miles, so I think it's pretty fair if I were to have run into some problems. So I think where I went wrong is that I too quickly modified the vehicle after purchasing it when I should have just driven it for a while stock to figure out what it actually needed maintenance-wise. Towards the end of my ownership as well, gas prices were insane, around $6 in California, so with the 9 miles per gallon this vehicle was getting, it just didn't make sense for me to daily it at that point. For a while I was thinking I was just going to keep it parked and then just drive it when I wanted to hit a trail with a friend. But with gas prices getting higher and me not being able to figure out those peripheral problems, I ended up just deciding to sell it. Thankfully, I was able to get most of my money back as the price had really jumped up for when I originally purchased it. But looking back, it's pretty difficult to find these in decent condition, so the whole thing's kind of bittersweet. So as a previous owner of an 80 series, I'll go over the few pieces of advice that I have. First off, know if you're going to modify it or keep it stock. With prices going up and fewer examples being available, the market is kind of being split right now between those who want a stock original example and those who want to modify and off-road their 80 series. If you want to off-road yours, I'd highly recommend trying to find one that's already been modified. Modified examples typically go for a lot less than those that are original, and nowadays I'd actually say that there are more listings that are modified compared to those that are stock. This way you'll be saving yourself time and money, and you won't be devaluing the vehicle as well too. My next piece of advice is to not be afraid of high mileage, but be wary of the maintenance history. As I mentioned, these vehicles are typically super reliable, but that depends on how well they've been maintained, to a degree. The three big things that I would look out for would be to see if the head gasket has been replaced relatively recently, to see if the knuckles have been rebuilt, and to see if the cooling system has been refreshed. Finally, I'd like to mention, if you've found yourself a good example, just hold on to it. Just focus on keeping the maintenance up, and you'll continue just cruising along.